Notice anything familiar with this city street in China? If you are familiar with American institutions, you might recognize the golden arches of McDonald's or even the smiling face of Colonel Sanders from KFC. How do these Western fast food restaurants find their way into China? To answer that question, we will have to consider how traditional Chinese food culture has changed to what they have today. To give some background, the contemporary fast food atmosphere in China today has its roots in traditional street market stalls spread across many Chinese cities. If you've watched any American food television on China, odds are these market stalls were brought up. That's because of the rich history these street foods have towards Chinese cuisine. Some of these foods can be seen here with the popular Chinese dish dim sum. Even as the country attempts to modernize, it still holds a unique nostalgia for what they see as traditional. This is the theme that we see as we examine the contemporary food culture that there is today. So that brings us to our research question. In what ways has Chinese fast casual food culture changed as China has increasingly modernized with urbanization and globalization? What do we mean by food culture? Well, let's first define culture. Culture is that complex whole which includes some knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. By being a part of the group, you agree to the norms that go with that group. Cuisine is a part of that culture. It is culturally defined, looking at what foodstuffs are considered edible or inedible, how those foods are prepared, how they are served, and how we eat them. What may be considered taboo, inedible food in American culture may very well be considered a regular food item in another. The same can be said about cooking methods, dining preferences, and so on. This is what I mean by when I say food culture, a culture's thoughts and feelings surrounding food. When looking at the contemporary, it is helpful to get a sense of where we have been. So let's look at the traditional food culture in China. Developed over centuries, the traditional culture is indigenous in origin. Using foods and practices developed by the people in China, the indigenous nature of these foods helped define it as being Chinese. The traditional culture is also highly regional. China is a huge country, and thus has developed food cultures that are unique to each region. Certain foods and cooking methods are often associated with one region, like hot pot is considered to be from the Sichuan region. Family plays a big part into how meals are eaten and served, with the elders often have more to say at the dinner table and are often served first. Children also play a role in family meals as well. This goes into how food culture is group-oriented. The meals themselves are often made to be shared or prepared by others. A meal like hot pot is traditionally done with others and is a group meal. Most meals are centered around the group. It is also largely patriarchal. The male, while not often responsible for cooking the food or its preparation, reaps many of the benefits at the expense of the woman. Women are often served last, and if they are served at all, since if the amount of food is small, wives and mothers may forego their portion for the rest of the family. All these traits make up what we mean by when I say traditional food culture in China. The idea of fast food can trace its roots as far back as the 13th century in China to the Song dynasty. The economic successes of the dynasty allowed people to start eating 3 meals a day and eating out at restaurants. Traditional food market stalls like the ones seen here are lined on Chinese streets, often selling quick, cheap, and convenient foods that appeal to the fast nature of Chinese cities. It gives people a source of readily available meals that are appealing and also affordable to most people. These street foods are woven into the culture and traditions surrounding food in China, and the quick service nature of these stalls allowed Western fast food restaurants to fit into the food landscape in China. For much of the country's rich and long history, tradition has been associated with Confucianism. Many of the Chinese practices and beliefs centered around its teachings, such as filial piety and the civil service exam. As time came to pass with the Song and Ming dynasties, some started to become critical of the tradition. As the people tried to reform it, the state, who backed Confucian beliefs, was not able to bat away Western imperialism in the modern Japan. Incidents like the Boxer Rebellion and the First Sino-Japanese War led to stunning defeats and humiliation on part of the Chinese. This led to many blaming Confucianism for the country's failures, and as the Qing dynasty falls in 1912, people begin to separate themselves into pro-reform and pro-dismantle of the Confucian system. This division is what allows Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communist Party to succeed in taking over the country in their attempts to bring China to modernity. So how do we get to the contemporary China we know today? Well, it's a bit of a long and complicated story. With Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, many consider that to be the modern era of China, where tradition was often forgone in the hopes of embracing what it means to be modern. However, there were several problems with this era in Chinese history, problems we won't go into today, but help us better understand the postmodern era China enters into after Mao dies. Well, Mao did not want to connect with the West, his successor did, and he decides that the way for China to truly modernize is to become a globalized nation. By doing so, he embraces an economic relationship with the West, particularly the United States. With that, there begins a trade relationship, but also one where cultures and ideas are shared as well. As China's economy booms with this Western relationship, we see the West become the modern example, one that is linked to what it means to become modern in China. This is in part due to the government's efforts to push this message, but also because the people of China begin to have a Western obsession, taking in Western pop culture, and also its institutions. With China's booming economy, a middle class forms, something that was not possible in Mao's China. To show their newfound wealth, the middle class buys Western products and eats at fast food restaurants that came from the West. In order to embrace modernity, China must also accept some of its influences. One of those is urbanization. Simply defined as a rapid buildup of cities and their populations, urbanization sees more and more people choosing to live and work in cities, and choosing to share in its resources and its culture. By 2025, China is hoping to integrate 70% of its rural population into these urban centers. With that, there will be fundamental changes to ecosystems and especially food systems, since most of China's food production relies on small-scale rural farmers to produce their food. This urbanization will also change what foods people eat and how they eat them. China is also embracing globalization and sharing in the interdependence of the world's economies and cultures. With that comes Western influences. Looking to create footholds in other parts of the world they weren't able to take by brute force, the United States starts a theme of cultural imperialism, where they use Western institutions, like fast food restaurants, to create a codependency between the two countries, where either feels they cannot retaliate towards each other in fear of loss in culture or economic standing. With these, modernity starts to influence the role of what it means to be modern in China. So, is this a fast food republic? That is hard to say. 97% of the Chinese people have eaten at a fast food restaurant at some point in their lives. 27% of that population eats out at a fast food restaurant weekly. Compare this to Americans, where close to a third of the population eats out at a fast food restaurant on any given day. Since fast food is often relatively expensive, it is seen as more of a celebratory meal in China, especially those near the middle or low class. The opening of doors to American business led to an explosion of American fast food joints. KFC is the first to enter China, opening up its two-story restaurant in 1987 in the middle of Tiananmen Square in Beijing. In the 2 decades since, KFC has grown to over 4,500 restaurants. McDonald's and Pizza Hut are closely behind them and compete for the same market share by sharing their Western products while also adapting their menus to fit the new Chinese market. This has led to an expansion of what McDonald's and KFC foods look like in China as they work to make their menus more representative of the foods of the region. While menus have expanded, they are largely the same wherever you go around the world. A Big Mac in Beijing will look and taste very similar to one that you can find in America. As China's middle class grows, so does its spending power. Now with money to spend, this new generation no longer has to consult their family for new jobs and purchases. Women are seeking jobs outside of the home, impacting their role in the child-rearing process. The ideal husband is now seen as the one that does the cooking and the maintaining of the home, something that is unfamiliar by traditional standards. As China's economy expands, the family unit starts to center itself on the couple rather than the parents and in-laws, something that is a deviation from traditional Confucian roots. This change allows the couple to use its money to build for personal efforts, which means they may begin participating in a modern global world. This change also coincides with the one-child policy in China that leads to a generation of little emperors that may have more say in the decisions of the family. Children have become more respected in the Chinese economy. Before the 1980s, children rarely ate outside of the home. Now, with money to spend and more individualized attention, Chinese children have led a consumer revolution in China. Before McDonald's came to China, many paid little attention to their calendar birthday. After McDonald's started to advertise American-style birthdays to young children, it became more of a celebration among the Chinese middle class. Parents, to expose their children to more culture, want their children to visit fast food restaurants. As they expose their children, these restaurants become more of a source of quick food rather than a cultural experience for the young people in China, further showing their integration in Chinese society. Globalization is a two-way street. As American foods have become popular in China, so have Chinese foods in the United States. America's cuisine has become so globalized that it is hard to define American cuisine due to the many influences from countries around the world. Chinese food is a part of that and is associated with the quick and cheap eats in the United States. However, the United States has largely made their Chinese food their own Americanized version. This leaves many Chinese visitors and immigrants unable to recognize the Chinese in Chinese food while they're in the United States. Even with modernity's influences trying to change aspects of China's food culture, many still long for what they feel is traditional. A sort of cultural nostalgia in China has been used to fight back against modernity's influences. Instead of embracing the global food culture, many yearn for what they feel is traditional. The quick service nature of fast food restaurants play into that nostalgia, since it is familiar to the traditional street market foods many Chinese associate with quick and convenient meals. As the population changes in China as well, there have been a rise in solo diners. These diners turn to more Western restaurants because they cater to the individual compared to many Chinese restaurants that are group-oriented. Also, these globalized food cultures rival the indigenous foods and food cultures that have been in place for centuries. This runs the risk of erasing those indigenous roots as the country chooses to embrace a modern global world. There has been a change in diet as well. Traditional Chinese diets are considered to be one of the healthiest, based in whole grains and vegetables. However, more contemporary diets are starting to look more and more Western, with more animal-based products and more sodium, more fat, and more processed foods. This change in diet has led to health problems as well, such as obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. It is important to know, however, that although consumption of fast food is rising in China, it is more so the nutritional transition that is causing a rise in obesity. According to the International Obesity Task Force, in the year 2000, 15% of children aged 2 to 6 years of age and 8% of children and adolescents aged 7 to 17 years were overweight or obese in China. By the end of the year 2000, the obesity rate of male students in Beijing reached 15%, doubling that from 1990. Moreover, in the year 2005, the prevalence of childhood obesity and overweightness in China was 32.5% for male students and 17.6% for female students in the northern big cities of China. From 1993 to 2009, obesity in China increased from 3% to 11% in men and 5% to 10% for women. It is this rise in processed foods and fats that are causing this rise in obesity in Chinese cities. What does this changing nature of China's fast food culture have to say about modernity and tradition? Well, it is certainly a complex relationship. While modernity has brought many choices and food options to the Chinese, many still cling on to what they feel is traditional. Instead of completely foregoing their indigenous foods for a more global diet, they instead force these companies to adapt to their needs and preferences, which are largely based in that of traditional food culture in China. That nostalgia for tradition has not truly allowed modernity to take over all of China's culture, and instead forces it to come up with invented traditions, like fast food restaurants, to meet that need for traditional street food. So, in conclusion, rather than only existing in opposition to the traditional Chinese fast service market stalls, Western fast food restaurants have contributed to the expansion of what the definition of fast service food means in China. It has given space for modernity to show its power, but not completely take over, since tradition still has such a tight hold on China. Here's some of my sources as well. And thank you.